Stories of infidelity in politics, entertainment, and business occur so regularly these days that we almost take them for granted. When a major political figure is involved, many people will roll their eyes and shake their heads. Some artists have written songs about being cheated on or being cheaters themselves that become massive hits in the music world. It's probably not a shock then when I tell you that infidelity scandals also happen in the academic world. Professors have affairs, relationships are destroyed, people are hurt. But for the most part, the progress of science and scholarship continue. In the case of psychology, however, one of these scandals profoundly affected the development of our field because it came at a time when psychology was rapidly growing in popularity and there was a heightened emphasis on doing psychology experimentally. This scandal shook psychology because the professor involved was one of its key leaders at the time. His name? John B. Watson. Before we get to the scandal, let me tell you more about Watson. John Watson was born in 1878 in South Carolina in the United States, the fourth of 6 children. His father was an alcoholic who had affairs, was frequently between jobs, and was abusive to his wife and children. When John was 13, his father abandoned the family for another woman. John, as a teen, was not a very good student and was arrested several times for fighting and once for shooting a gun inside the city limits. Somehow, despite this environment, Watson got himself admitted to Furman University. He was handsome, articulate, and very bright. At Furman, he did excel and ended up leaving with a master's degree and being admitted as a graduate student in the philosophy and psychology department at the University of Chicago. His Ph.D. work concentrated on the nervous system of white rats. He demonstrated that the increasing complexity in the behavior of developing young rats was strongly correlated with the growth of myelin sheaths around the neural fibers in their brains. In 1903, he published his thesis, Animal Education, the Psychical Development of the White Rat. Watson had become a departmental star at UChicago. He was the youngest Ph.D. yet turned out by the university, with the second best final examination in the department's history. Success came at a price, however, for Watson had to hold several jobs to support himself, and overwork contributed to an emotional breakdown. He could not sleep without a light on and suffered anxiety attacks that dissipated only after taking 10-mile walks. He later hinted that sexual concerns may have been involved when he reported that his breakdown, quote, prepared me to accept a large part of Freud, unquote. His emotional problems coincided with complications in his personal life, following his rejection by one young woman he had fallen in love with, and his subsequent engagement to a 19-year-old student named Mary Ickes. Mary's brother Harold, a rising figure in Chicago politics who would later become FDR's Secretary of the Interior and oversaw the implementation of Roosevelt's New Deal program, saw Watson as unreliable, and he violently opposed the match with his sister. Thus, Watson and Mary married secretly in December of 1903, but lived apart and did not publicly declare their status until the fall of 1904. But Watson's professional life was much more successful. He was considered one of the leading figures in the newly emerging field of animal psychology and was soon in demand by other universities. In 1908, Johns Hopkins offered him a position as an associate professor at a salary of $2,500 a year. At the time, Watson was an instructor at Chicago, and while he hesitated about the offer, Johns Hopkins came back to him with an increased offer of a full professorship and a salary of $3,500 a year. So he and Mary moved to Baltimore when he was 29. Amazingly, a sex scandal occurred at Johns Hopkins almost as soon as he arrived. The chair of the department, James Mark Baldwin, a prominent psychologist in his own right, and the editor of an influential journal, Psychological Review, had been found in an illegal brothel during a police raid. Baldwin was eventually forced to resign when the story broke months later, leaving Watson the chair of the department and the new editor of Psychological Review. In the next 10 years, Watson used his new powers to pressure the university to separate psychology from philosophy and forged new ties between psychology and biology. He used his editorship to promote his vision of behaviorism. He defined psychology as the study of behavior and successfully ran for the presidency of the American Psychological Association in 1915. People in psychology listened to him and were greatly influenced by his ideas. I made another video about behaviorism that features Watson, in which you can learn more about his contributions to psychology during this time of his life. In 1919, he published Psychology from the Standpoint of a Behaviorist. This book aimed to be a general text concentrating on human behavior, covering subjects such as thought, language, child development, and emotion. He began by asking what human emotional responses were innate and unconditioned. This book was largely theoretical, and Watson planned to start a longitudinal study with hundreds of infants to examine how conditioning worked in humans. In the fall of 1919, he hired a research assistant to help him on this project. Her name was Rosalie Rayner. She turned 20 that fall when she began working with him on the infant project. Rosalie was a recent graduate of Vassar College, and she was from a prominent family in Baltimore, the city where Johns Hopkins is located. The project that Rayner and Watson worked on involved hundreds of children. One study they worked on together is rather famous, and if you have studied psychology, you probably know about it. It's the Little Albert study, in which the researchers attempted to condition fear in the 11-month-old son of a worker in the hospital where they conducted the experiment. This is actual film of Rosalie holding Albert, and you can see Watson presenting Albert with different furry objects, including a monkey, a dog, and a rat, all of which Albert showed no natural fear. But by striking a steel bar with a hammer just behind Albert's head, they could condition a fear response in him whenever he saw the rat again. I do talk much more about the details of this study in my other video, so I won't go into them now. I'll just say that Little Albert's study is one of the most famous and controversial in the psychological literature. There are still heated discussions about the ethics of the study and whether these experiences permanently damaged Albert. I think it's also interesting that Albert wasn't his real name, it was Donald. But Albert was the name of Rosalie's father. Was that a coincidence? Perhaps you've guessed by now that Rosalie and John started an affair during this time. Watson was 42 and had 2 children with Mary, a boy, John, and a girl, Mary, whom they nicknamed Polly. It's also important to note that Watson had a reputation as being a ladies' man. He was good-looking and adored by his students, who voted him handsomest professor in the 1919 yearbook. His sexual conquests were a topic of conversation on campus, and one historian described him as obsessed with the pursuit of women. One person who knew Watson at this time said that, quote, Watson was never involved in any love triangle, but in a romantic polyhedron of undeterminable dimensionality. Historian John Burnham wrote, I have since interviewed many people who knew and worked with Watson, including his brother, 3 of his children, and his first wife, Mary Ickes. As they talked about their memories of Watson, I learned a great deal about him as a person. He may truly have been one of the great lovers in all history. I found that people remembered his romantic adventures and the public persona he presented as a ladies' man, and each time I tried to find out about his work in psychology, what I heard about instead was some woman with whom he supposedly went to bed. In short, I learned a great deal that I did not want to know, some of it of the most intimate nature. So it's against this backdrop that Watson begins his affair with Rayner. They worked late on the project many days a week, and by early 1920, were escaping for weekend encounters at Rosalie's friend's apartment in New York City. They fell deeply in love and wrote passionate letters to one another. Somewhere along the way, his wife Mary learned of the affair, but didn't confront John. Because she had dealt with his other infidelities, she apparently hoped to get him back. So, what she did instead was become social friends with the Rayners, Rosalie's parents. Over the next several months, she had them over for dinner with John and Rosalie present. And the Rayners, in turn, would invite John and Mary to their house. Around February 1920, Mary found a love letter from Rosalie in Watson's pockets. It was passionate, but Mary didn't talk to Watson about it. Instead, she took her son and daughter to New York one weekend to see her other brother, John Ickes. Unlike his older brother in politics, John Ickes appears to have been a sketchy, corrupt character. He suggested that Mary see an attorney in Brooklyn and the attorney indicated that she would need to get some letters from Watson to Rosalie to confirm the affair. It's unclear what Mary wanted at this point. Some historians believe that Mary would never want to divorce John. She just wanted him to end things with Rosalie. After this meeting in New York, Mary decided she needed to get into Rosalie's bedroom and search for letters from Watson. Luckily, John and Mary were again invited for dinner with the Rayners. After dinner, Mary suggested that Rosalie and Watson might like to talk about their work, but she had a raging headache. Could she lie down somewhere? Mary managed to take this rest in Rosalie's bedroom. As soon as she was inside, she locked the door, began searching, and soon found 14 letters from Watson to Rosalie. Concealing any emotional reaction she might have had upon discovering them, she didn't make a scene and rejoined the conversation with the rest of the guests until it was time to go home. She returned to see her brother in New York City later with the 14 letters. John Ickes made photocopies of them. Mary felt these letters gave her the leverage to force her husband to leave Rosalie. Only one of these letters was ever made public. Here's what Watson wrote in this one. Rosalie mine. I got another nice letter in the noon mail. It did my aching heart a lot of good. Tell me what happened at Ruth's party. I am so jealous. I know it isn't nice to have doubts and fears, but they will grow up. That would be our hardest battle if we were married, wouldn't it? I've been an awful sinner, I know, and in a way, so have you. We both have the power of getting what we go for, and neither would take an inferior position of the other. I think this fear and the knowledge that the other one could do the same thing will be our salvation. I just think I'll die if I don't hear from you. If I thought you were in, I'd call you, dangerous as it is. Every time the phone rings, I know I'll jump from my chair. My heart will be in my throat, but I can listen anyway. Do write to me that no matter how long you stay, your heart and body will still be mine. They can't break it now, can they? Only a change in one of us can do that. I know every cell I have is yours individually and collectively. My total reactions are positive and towards you. So likewise, each and every heart reaction. He said that he, quote, made enough love for one day to so young a girl, but proceeded to make yet more love. It makes me just mad when I come to the end of your letters. Does it to you that way? Could you kiss me tonight for a few hours without growing weary? I could you for 24 hours, and then find fault with the universe because the days are not longer. Let us go to the North Pole, where the days and nights are 6 months long. Ending the letter with their plans for another weekend together, he wrote, everything will be lovely and we ought to play safe. Still, play we will. John and Mary Watson continued dining at the Rayners' home until the end of March. Sometime around then, Mary confronted her husband. She told him she knew everything about the affair. She reminded him he was running a terrible risk that could end his career at Johns Hopkins. He shouldn't ruin everything because of his crush on Rosalie. John told Mary that he would end the affair and no longer employ Rosalie. But of course, this was a lie. He was deeply in love with Rosalie and just tried to be even more discreet about their affair. I just want to interrupt here to ask you that if you are enjoying this video, would you please consider giving it a like and maybe even hitting that subscribe button so you can see other videos that I put out. It's really the only way for me to really know whether or not anybody's really watching these videos and what kind of content people like. So I appreciate you doing that. So Mary Watson's next tactic was to go right to Rosalie's parents. She made an appointment to see them, and Rosalie was there too. Mary told the Rayners about the letters, the affair, everything. And then she suggested that the Rayners send Rosalie to Europe for a year to get away from her husband and meet new people. Mary also said that she didn't blame Rosalie. She knew her husband was very attractive and had flattered Rosalie with his attentions. Mary assured Rosalie that her crush on her husband would melt away once they were apart. Albert Rayner, the father, agreed with Mary and stated that a separation would be best. Everyone seemed to agree this was the best plan, but one person. Rosalie. Rosalie simply refused to go. Her father threatened to cut her off without a penny if she didn't go to Europe. But she refused. Rosalie loved Watson. She would stay in Baltimore. And Mary Watson could make as many scenes as she wanted. Mary then tried to convince John to end the affair again, threatening to expose the letters if he didn't stop seeing her. But none of this worked. On April 14th, John and Mary separated. Back at the university, life couldn't have been any better for John Watson. In the same month he separated from Mary, the university increased his salary to $6,000 a year after he had threatened to leave to become the chair of Harvard's psychology department. His university president had even been able to give Watson special permission to have large bottles of whiskey in his laboratory for research that Watson was doing on the effects of alcohol on dexterity. This was during Prohibition, and there was Watson giving research participants shots of whiskey and then instructing them to throw darts at a dartboard. Watson himself took part in the experiment. All through the summer of 1920, everything seemed to be going as normal. His experiments were proceeding, and the university announced his teaching schedule for the coming year. But during the summer, Mary kept trying to get John to come back to her. She promised to burn the letters and forget about the divorce if only he would return to her. Watson was aware of the risk he was running, so he came up with a counter-proposal. John asked Mary to move to Switzerland for 2 years with the children. He would pay for everything. Then, after 2 years, they could file for divorce due to separation, and there would be no scandal. His position at the university would remain. But Mary refused to go. In the meantime, Mary's brother John Ickes was trying to get money for himself. He went to Albert Rayner and told him he had copies of the 14 letters he would be happy to destroy for the right price. Given the Rayners' position in Baltimore society, Ickes believed Albert would eventually pay vast sums of money to keep his daughter's name clean. Ickes kept pressuring and threatening Albert Rayner all that summer, but it looks like he never did receive his pot of gold. And then, sometime between September 20th and 28th, the president of the university either heard of or saw some of Watson's letters. To this day, we don't know how this happened. It could have been due to Mary. It could have been Albert Rayner, who was upset about what happened to his daughter and wanted Watson to suffer. Or it might have been John Ickes, who never got his money for those letters and finally unleashed his frustrations by exposing Watson. We also don't know why the university president, Goodnow, decided that action had to be taken. A detailed document about the affair was sent to university executives for discussion, but that was eventually destroyed. Most of Watson's key allies at the university argued that Watson had to go. This was a co-educational institution, and it would hurt the university's reputation if a professor were having an affair with a student. Watson was then called into President Goodnow's office. Goodnow reportedly told Watson that he had a choice. He could resign or be fired. But the resignation had to take place right then and there. So Watson was forced to write a brief note that said, quote, "I hereby tender my resignation as professor of psychology to take immediate effect," unquote. There was no additional explanation. Years later, Watson angrily wrote about this event. It left him, quote, "stranded economically and to some extent emotionally," unquote. He was angry with his colleagues who didn't stick up for him. He didn't think he had done anything wrong that deserved this response. But he soon left Baltimore and went to New York to live with an old friend from graduate school. For the next couple of months, he was employed by a large advertising company to conduct a survey of people who wore rubber boots in the South. While he was there, interviewing customers about their uses of their boots, Mary filed for divorce, and news of the case hit the Baltimore papers. Soon the sordid details of the affair and Watson's resignation were in all the national newspapers. When Watson came back to New York City in December after his trip to the South, he found his picture in all the papers, including the New York Times. Someone in late November had leaked the name of Rosalie to the press, and they were soon knocking on the door of the Rayner residence asking for comment. Rosalie's address was published. The letter I read you earlier was printed in full in the papers. The divorce itself was granted on December 24th. Watson would pay Mary $4,500 in alimony. She would get their holiday house in Canada, estimated at $10,000. Each of the kids would receive $1,200 a year until they turned 18 or married. Mary got all of the furniture and a $10,000 insurance policy. Watson was now heavily in debt. But 2 weeks later, Rosalie and John married in a private ceremony. In the months that followed, John Watson contacted his extensive network of influential academics to see if they could hire him. No one would touch him. One famous colleague at Cornell, Edward Titchener, advised that he should just lay low for 5 years. Of course, Watson was now heavily in debt and unemployed. But he eventually was offered a permanent position at the J. Walter Thompson Advertising Agency at a salary of $25,000 a year, 4 times his previous professor's pay. And he plunged into his new career with typical vigor. He started by getting practical experience in the field, peddling U-Bahn coffee in Pittsburgh, and working part-time as a clerk in Macy's department store in New York to study consumer attitudes. He helped plan many innovative and successful advertising campaigns in the main office. He popularized the idea of a coffee break to market Maxwell House coffee. He got Queen Marie of Romania to endorse the beauty-enhancing qualities of Pond's cold cream in one of the first uses of celebrity testimonials in advertising. He hired pediatricians to vouch for the infection-fighting properties of Johnson & Johnson's baby powder, and pretty models to suggest that it was okay for women to smoke as long as they brushed their teeth with Pebaco toothpaste. As Watson put it, I began to learn that it can be just as thrilling to watch the growth of a sales curve of a new product as it is to watch the learning curve of animals or man. By 1924, he was vice president of the agency. Rosalie and John seemed to have a happy life together, and by some accounts, John didn't have any more affairs once they were together. They had 2 sons, one born in 1922 and the other in 1924. The couple wrote magazine articles together and offered child-rearing advice. John published best-selling psychology books and became a popular radio talk show guest. By 1930, Watson no longer had anything to do with academic or scientific psychology. It's hard to imagine what would have happened if this scandal had not occurred and Watson had remained in scientific psychology. His work on children was never completed, nor was his research on alcohol. Watson had many ideas about how a scientific experiment-based psychology should go, but that was all stopped when he was only 42. No one else had that same sort of singular influence on psychology, besides maybe Freud, at that time. You could argue that it wasn't until after World War II that psychology recovered from his absence, when people like Skinner, Fessinger, Tolman, Bowlby, Guilford, and others took psychology to the next level. The story of Watson and Rosalie didn't really end happily. The boys were diligently trained to be practical, self-reliant, fearless, and masculine, with expressions of affection or emotional tenderness strictly curbed. The outcome of all of this is unclear because Rosalie died suddenly of dysentery in 1935 at the age of 36. Both boys were subsequently sent to boarding school, and the deeply shaken Watson had only sporadic contact with them afterwards. Both sons went on to successful academic and occupational careers. One became a Freudian psychiatrist, and the other an industrial psychologist and vice president of a major food company. But both were plagued by severe depression as adults. One attempted suicide before being helped by psychoanalytic therapy, and the other, the psychiatrist, took his own life in 1963. The surviving son, while recognizing his father's virtues, has placed much of the blame on his father's child-rearing practices. I have some unhappy thoughts about it, the effects of behavioristic principles on my being raised into an adult. In many ways, I adored my father as an individual and as a character. He was bright, he was charming, he was masculine, witty, and reflective, but he was also conversely unresponsive, emotionally uncommunicative, unable to express and cope with any feelings of emotion of his own, and determined unwittingly to deprive, I think, my brother and me of any kind of emotional foundation. He was very rigid in carrying out his fundamental philosophies as a behaviorist. The history of this scandal has also taken some interesting turns over the decades. Historians and psychologists have often pondered the real reason for Watson's dismissal from Hopkins. Why wasn't he allowed to divorce Mary and then just marry Rosalie, and he could have stayed a professor at Johns Hopkins? One speculation passed down over the years was the unfounded rumor that Rosalie and John were conducting experiments on human sexuality at the time of the affair, and Mary walked in on them in the laboratory one day with the equipment hooked up to record their sexual responses. One historian told this story in his textbook in the late 1960s, which other historians then picked up and put in their books. It included a picture of some of the alleged equipment that was donated to the Canadian Psychological Association's archives. But many years later, a great historian of psychology, Ludi Benjamin, thoroughly investigated this rumor, and in a 2007 article in the American Psychologist, thoroughly debunked this story. including the fantastic disappearance of the equipment from the Canadian archives. Benjamin and his colleagues explained that Watson's firing from Johns Hopkins was simply due to the embarrassment of Watson's conduct to the university. They had already dealt with his predecessor's firing caused by that raid of a brothel, and they had two other prominent professors who had also been fired for similar reasons. Still, I found it interesting how historians have looked at the scandal over the decades. Many have said that it shows us how puritanical America was, especially in 1920. A prominent psychologist was fired for a mere affair. It's only more recently that people have begun to reflect on the clear power differential between this famous professor who was the chair of his department and a student, researcher, assistant who had just turned 20. That might be why so many universities today have codes of conduct prohibiting these kinds of relationships. They are, of course, prey to problems of harassment, power, and control. What do you think about this scandal? Do you think Watson should have been fired? Do you think if a similar situation happened today, that the academic should be fired or asked to resign? I'm curious to hear what you think. I can tell you that I've known several similar stories during my time in academia. Some ended happily, and some ended with people losing their jobs. Some involved horrible instances of harassment, and others involved relationships that appeared to be 100% mutual. What Rosalie and John did still happens today, just with fewer ramifications for an entire scientific field, as was the case in 1920. Now, if you've enjoyed this video, I hope you'll consider watching this one next. It's about this really amazing woman who contributed so much to psychology and to everyday life, but very few people know about her. Until I see you next time, stay curious. Thanks for watching.